Sometimes help arrives in the most unexpected forms, carried on the wings of a storm and delivered by 4 hooves. In the remote ranching country of Montana, where neighbors can be 20 miles apart and a blizzard can cut you off from the world in minutes, one woman was about to discover that survival sometimes depends on the intelligence of animals and the willingness of strangers to risk everything. Bianca Spears stood at her kitchen window, watching the Montana sky transform from steel gray to an ominous shade of green-black that every rancher in the high plains knew meant serious trouble. The November wind had been building all afternoon, and now it howled around the corners of her ranch house with a voice that sounded almost alive. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, and the first snowflakes were beginning to swirl in the gathering darkness. At 36 years old, Bianca had spent enough winters in Montana to recognize the signs of a major storm. This wasn't going to be one of those gentle snowfalls that dusted the landscape in white and melted by noon. This was going to be a blizzard, the kind that paralyzed the entire region and left ranchers isolated for days. She'd already spent the afternoon preparing, bringing her 18 horses into the barn, securing loose equipment, stacking firewood on the covered porch, and filling every container with water in case the pipes froze. Her nearest neighbor had called earlier to warn her that the Weather Service was predicting whiteout conditions and possible power outages. The Mountain View Ranch had been in Bianca's family for 3 generations, but she was the first woman to run it alone. Her father had passed away 2 years ago, leaving her 3,000 acres of rugged Montana grassland that stretched from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the banks of Jefferson Creek. Her older brother had moved to California years ago and showed no interest in ranching, and her younger sister lived in Chicago with her own family. That left Bianca as the sole heir to a legacy she both loved and struggled to maintain. Running a ranch alone wasn't just physically demanding, it was lonely in ways that were hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. Days would pass when the only voices she heard were her own, and those of the horses and cattle that depended on her. The isolation had intensified after her fiancé Lloyd had died in a trucking accident 18 months ago. They'd been planning to merge their operations, to build something together that would carry both their families' legacies forward. His death had left her not just grief-stricken but also facing the reality that she would be managing everything alone. She'd spent the months after his death moving through her days on autopilot, completing tasks because they needed to be done, not because she felt any particular connection to them anymore. Her father had always said that ranching chose you, not the other way around. You were born to it or you weren't, and if you fought against that calling, you'd be miserable your whole life. Bianca had been born to it. She couldn't imagine living anywhere else, doing anything else. But lately, she'd started to understand the difference between loving the land and loving the life. The land she loved fiercely. The loneliness was slowly killing her. The wind gusted harder, rattling the windows and making the house creak. Bianca checked her phone, noting that she still had service, though that probably wouldn't last once the storm hit in earnest. She pulled on her heavy winter coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical force, and the wind immediately tried to tear the door from her hands. She wrestled it closed and made her way toward the barn, leaning into the wind, each step requiring conscious effort. The snow was already beginning to accumulate, and the sky had taken on that peculiar quality that preceded the worst storms, a kind of yellow-green darkness that made everything look strange and threatening. The barn was warm compared to the outside, filled with the comforting sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the sweet smell of hay. Bianca's horses were her pride and her solace. She'd built a small but respected breeding program focused on working ranch horses, animals with the intelligence and endurance needed for the demanding work of managing cattle in rough terrain. Her lead stallion, a magnificent buckskin named Maverick, nickered softly as she entered. She'd raised him from a foal, and he was probably the closest thing she had to a friend these days, which was a depressing thought but also undeniably true. Bianca made her rounds, checking water buckets, ensuring each horse had adequate hay, speaking softly to each animal. They seemed restless, picking up on the atmospheric pressure changes that preceded major storms. Animals always knew before humans did when something significant was coming. Her father had taught her to pay attention to animal behavior, to trust their instincts even when human logic suggested otherwise. The horses tonight were telling her this storm was going to be bad. She was just finishing her checks when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was frantic, desperate, coming from outside the barn. Bianca froze, listening. The wind made it hard to distinguish individual sounds, but there it was again, the unmistakable whinny of a horse in extreme distress. Not the casual call of a horse looking for companionship, but the desperate cry of an animal in trouble. Bianca hurried to the barn door and pulled it open against the wind. What she saw made her heart stop. Standing in her driveway, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a horse. But this wasn't one of her animals. This was a chestnut mare, her flanks heaving with exertion, her coat dark with sweat despite the freezing temperature. The mare was alone and clearly terrified. Foam covered her chest and shoulders, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. She was wearing a halter. The animal called out again, the desperate sound of a horse that had been pushed beyond its limits and was begging for help. Bianca didn't hesitate. She grabbed a lead rope and ran toward the mare, fighting the wind with every step. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to just a few yards. She had to get the horse into the barn before the full force of the storm hit. "Easy, girl," Bianca called out, approaching slowly despite the urgency. "Easy now. You're safe." The mare's eyes were wide with fear, showing white around the edges, but she didn't bolt when Bianca reached for her halter. The animal was exhausted, that much was clear. Her legs trembled, and foam covered her chest and neck. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, an urgency, an almost human desperation to communicate. Bianca clipped the lead rope to the halter and led the mare toward the barn. The animal followed willingly, as if she'd been searching for exactly this kind of shelter. But she kept calling out, kept tossing her head, trying to tell Bianca something. Once inside, Bianca closed the barn door against the storm and turned her full attention to the mysterious visitor. The mare was a beautiful animal, well-bred and well cared for. Her coat, beneath the sweat and dirt, was a rich chestnut that suggested quality bloodlines. She stood about 15.5 hands, with the sturdy build of a ranch horse rather than the delicate frame of a show animal. This wasn't some neglected animal. This was someone's valued horse, and something had gone terribly wrong. Bianca's hands moved quickly, checking the mare for injuries, running her fingers over the horse's legs and body, looking for cuts or swelling. That's when she noticed something strange. Attached to the mare's tail with what looked like duct tape was a small waterproof pouch, the kind used by kayakers to keep documents dry. It had been secured carefully, wrapped multiple times to ensure it wouldn't come loose during a hard ride. Someone had taken the time to protect whatever was inside, even while clearly working under desperate circumstances. Bianca's pulse quickened. With trembling fingers, she carefully peeled away the tape, trying not to hurt the mare's tail. The pouch was sealed tight, and she had to work at it for a moment before getting it open. Inside was a piece of paper, folded and protected by the waterproof container. Bianca unfolded it, her heart pounding. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, as if written by someone whose hands were trembling badly. The note was short, direct, written with the economy of someone who knew they might not have much time. "My name is Eve Warner. I live at the old Mackenzie place 10 miles north on Timber Ridge Road. I'm having a heart attack. I'm alone. I took aspirin, but I can't get to my truck. Phone lines are down. Cell phone has no signal. I'm sending my horse Cinnamon because she knows the way to your ranch. We bought hay from you last summer. Please help me. I don't want to die alone. Time, 3:47 p.m. Bianca looked at her watch. It was 5:15 p.m. Almost an hour and a half had passed since Eve Warner had sent her horse for help. An hour and a half during which a woman having a heart attack had been alone, waiting, hoping that her desperate gamble would pay off. Bianca read the note twice, her mind struggling to process the implications. Eve Warner. The name stirred a vague memory. Last summer, a woman had come to buy hay, had paid cash and loaded it herself, refusing Bianca's offer of help. She'd been maybe 60 years old, lean and weathered, with the independent bearing of someone who'd spent her life doing things herself. They'd exchanged maybe 20 words total, just the bare minimum for the transaction. Bianca remembered thinking the woman seemed lonely but determined not to show it. And now that woman was dying alone while a blizzard descended. Bianca pulled out her cell phone. No service. The storm had already taken down the towers or overwhelmed the system. She tried her landline, running back to the house. Dead. The lines were down. She was completely cut off from the outside world. Every rational part of her brain said she should wait out the storm. That trying to reach the Mackenzie place in blizzard conditions was suicide. People died every year in Montana, trying to travel during storms like this. They got disoriented in the whiteout conditions, got stuck in drifts, froze to death within sight of shelter they couldn't see. But the note in her hand told a different story. Eve Warner had suffered a heart attack over an hour ago. Every minute that passed reduced her chances of survival. The woman was alone, dying, and she'd been smart enough and desperate enough to send her horse through an approaching storm to find help. Cinnamon, The mare standing in Bianca's barn had fought her way through increasingly dangerous conditions to deliver that message. How could Bianca ignore that kind of courage? What kind of person would she be if she stayed safe and warm, while someone died alone just 10 miles away? Bianca stood in her kitchen, the note in her hand, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was the kind of choice that defined a person, the kind you'd remember for the rest of your life regardless of which path you chose. If she stayed, she'd be safe. She'd also spend the rest of her life knowing she'd let someone die when she might have been able to help. If she went, she might die too. The storm was only getting worse, and 10 miles in these conditions might as well be 100. Bianca made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She would go. She'd take Maverick, her strongest and most sure-footed horse, and she'd let Cinnamon lead them back. A horse could navigate terrain that would stop a vehicle, and Cinnamon clearly knew the way home. The mare had found the Mountain View Ranch in increasingly difficult conditions. She could lead them back. It was insane, reckless, exactly the kind of decision that got people killed in Montana winters. And it was the only choice Bianca could live with. She worked quickly, her movements efficient from years of experience. She saddled Maverick, choosing her heaviest saddle for the extra weight and stability. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, fleece, and her heaviest winter coat rated for 40 below. She wrapped a scarf around her face, pulled on her best insulated gloves with chemical hand warmers inside, and put on her warmest hat. She packed her saddlebags with everything she could think of. Her comprehensive first aid kit, which contained aspirin, nitroglycerin tablets she'd gotten when her father had heart problems, blood pressure medication, and bandages. Extra blankets, more chemical hand warmers, waterproof matches, emergency flares, rope, a knife, her most powerful flashlight with extra batteries, and high-calorie emergency food bars. She left a detailed note on her kitchen table explaining where she'd gone and why, including Eve Warner's address and the time she'd left. If anyone came looking for her, at least they'd know where to search. She took one last look around her house, the house her great-grandfather had built, wondering if she'd ever see it again. Then she pushed that thought away. Fear was useless. Action was what mattered. Leading both horses out into the storm felt like stepping into another world. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind was now a physical force that required all her strength to stand against. Snow flew horizontally, stinging any exposed skin like needles. Visibility had been reduced to maybe 10 feet, if that. The world had been reduced to a small circle of white chaos. Bianca mounted Maverick and called to Cinnamon, who was already moving, pulling against her lead rope, desperate to get home to the woman who'd sent her. The mare knew something was wrong. Horses were intelligent enough to understand urgency, and Cinnamon had clearly been sent with a purpose she intended to fulfill. Bianca gave the mare her head, letting her lead the way while Maverick followed. She tied Cinnamon's lead rope to her saddle horn, creating a connection between the two horses. If visibility got any worse, she might lose sight of the chestnut mare entirely, but the rope would keep them together. They moved out into the storm, and within minutes, Bianca's ranch had disappeared behind them. There was nothing now but white and wind and cold. The storm was worse than she'd anticipated, and it was still building. This wasn't just a blizzard. This was going to be one of the big ones, the kind people talked about for years afterward. Wind speeds had to be approaching 50 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so thick it was like trying to breathe underwater. Cinnamon moved forward with determination, her head lowered against the wind, her body angled into the storm. The mare wasn't following a visible trail. There was no trail to follow in these conditions, but rather some internal sense of direction that horses possessed. Bianca had heard stories about horses finding their way home across impossible distances, navigating by landmarks only they could perceive, by some combination of memory and instinct that humans didn't fully understand. She was betting both their lives on that ability now. Maverick followed steadily, trusting Bianca's guidance even as the storm tried to push them sideways. The big buckskin had been through hard weather before, and he moved with the careful precision of an animal that understood the danger. Bianca could feel his muscles working beneath her, could sense his attention focused on every step. One wrong move, one hidden hole or ice patch, and they could both go down. In these conditions, a fall might be fatal. Time became meaningless. There was only the endless struggle forward, the constant battle against wind that tried to stop them, snow that tried to blind them, cold that tried to freeze them. Bianca's face was numb despite the scarf. Her fingers ached despite the gloves and hand warmers. She could feel ice forming on her eyelashes. making it hard to blink. Her lungs burned from breathing the frigid air. Several times she lost sight of Cinnamon completely, the mare disappearing into the white void ahead. Each time, panic would spike in Bianca's chest, but then she'd feel the tug of the lead rope, and she'd know the mare was still there, still leading them forward. They crossed what Bianca thought was frozen creek, the horses' hooves crunching through snow-covered ice. They climbed a rise that nearly defeated them, the horses scrambling for purchase on the frozen ground, while the wind tried to blow them backward. They descended into a ravine where the wind was momentarily less fierce, giving them a few precious seconds to catch their breath before climbing out the other side. Bianca had no idea if they were going the right direction. She was completely disoriented, unable to see any landmarks, trusting entirely in Cinnamon's homing instinct. The cold was becoming dangerous now, seeping through even her heavy layers. She could feel herself getting sluggish, her thoughts becoming slow and confused. That was the first sign of hypothermia, when your brain started to shut down, when you stopped caring about survival and just wanted to rest. She forced herself to stay alert, to focus. Eve Warner was depending on her. This woman she barely knew, who'd sent her horse through a storm with nothing but hope and a note, was counting on Bianca to be strong enough and stubborn enough to get there. Just when Bianca was beginning to think they'd gotten lost, that Cinnamon's sense of direction had finally failed, the mare's behavior changed. Her pace quickened and she started calling out, her voice desperate and urgent. Bianca strained her eyes against the snow and thought she could see something ahead, a darker mass against the white. Buildings. It had to be buildings. Cinnamon broke into a stumbling trot, pulling against the lead rope, and Maverick followed. Bianca's heart pounded with hope and relief. The old Mackenzie place materialized out of the storm like something from a dream. It was a small ranch, much more modest than Bianca's own, with a weathered house and a single barn. Cinnamon ran directly to the house, calling out desperately. The mare was exhausted, her legs shaking, her breathing labored, but she'd done it. She'd led them through a blizzard to the exact location of the woman who needed help. Bianca dismounted on legs that barely held her weight. Everything hurt, her fingers, her toes, her face. She was colder than she'd ever been in her life. But there was no time to deal with that. She tied both horses to the porch railing, knowing she needed to get them into shelter, but also knowing that the woman inside took priority. They'd survived this long, they could survive a few more minutes. She ran to the door and pounded on it. Eve Warner, it's Bianca Spears, I got your message." No response. Bianca tried the door. Locked. She ran around to the back of the house, fighting through snow that was already drifted 2 feet deep in places. She found a door that opened into a mudroom. "Eve," she called, moving through the dark house. The power was out, just as it was probably out across the entire county, and she had to use her flashlight to navigate. The beam of light showed a modest, tidy home. Everything in its place. The kind of house maintained by someone who lived alone and took pride in their space. She found Eve Warner in the living room, collapsed on the floor near the fireplace. The woman was conscious but barely, her face gray and slick with sweat despite the cold in the house, her breathing shallow and labored. A bottle of aspirin sat on the floor beside her, along with a glass of water, evidence that she'd followed the basic advice everyone knew about heart attacks: take aspirin and wait for help. But help had been almost 2 hours coming, and Eve looked like she was losing the fight. "Bianca," Eve whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came. I wasn't sure. Thought maybe Cinnamon wouldn't make it. Thought maybe you wouldn't come even if she did. It was crazy sending her." "It was brilliant," Bianca said, dropping to her knees beside the older woman. Her first aid training kicked in, the courses she'd taken years ago, because living this remotely meant you needed to be able to handle emergencies. "I'm here now. I've got medications that might help. How long ago did the pain start?" "Round 3. Came on sudden. Crushing pain in my chest, radiating down my left arm. Couldn't breathe right. Felt like an elephant sitting on my chest. I knew what it was. My father died of a heart attack when I was 20. I recognized the symptoms." Eve's voice was thready, weak, each word requiring obvious effort. "Phone was already dead from the storm. Cell phone, no signal. I remembered you lived south of here. Remembered Cinnamon always wanted to go back after we bought hay from you, like she'd found something interesting there." Bianca pulled out her emergency kit, her cold-numbed fingers fumbling with the zipper. She gave Eve nitroglycerin under her tongue, the tiny tablet that could help dilate blood vessels and improve blood flow to the heart. She positioned Eve to make breathing easier, elevating her upper body slightly with pillows she grabbed from the couch. She covered the woman with every blanket she could find, adding the ones she'd brought in her saddlebags, and tucked chemical hand warmers around her body to combat the shock and hypothermia that were compounding the cardiac emergency. "I'm gonna get you through this, Eve," Bianca said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Just stay with me. Stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me about Cinnamon. How long have you had her?" 8 years, Eve managed. "Got her as a 3-year-old. My husband and I trained her together. Best horse I ever owned. Smart, loyal, gentle. After my husband died, she was all I had left." The speaking seemed to be helping, giving Eve something to focus on besides the pain. I haltered her with shaking hands. Could barely get the halter on, kept dropping things. But I had to try, had to give myself a chance. "You did exactly right," Bianca assured her, monitoring Eve's pulse. It was irregular, skipping beats, a dangerous sign. The woman needed a hospital, needed cardiac intervention, but they were trapped. The storm was in full fury now, and there was no way to get to medical help. They would have to ride this out, just the two of them in this cold house with Bianca's limited medical supplies and even more limited knowledge. "Cinnamon is exhausted, but she's okay. She's a hero, Eve. She ran through the beginning of a blizzard to find help. She never gave up, never got confused. She led me straight back here through conditions where I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. She's my good girl," Eve whispered. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "I've been alone here since my husband died. 3 years. Everyone said I should move to town. Said I was too old to be ranching by myself. But this was our place, mine and Robert's. We built it together. I couldn't leave it. Couldn't leave Cinnamon." "You're not alone now," Bianca said firmly, making her voice as confident and strong as possible. "And we're going to get through this together. The storm will pass, and when it does, we'll get you to a hospital. But right now, I need you to stay with me. Stay awake, keep talking." She stood and moved quickly through the house, her training and ranching instincts taking over. The fireplace had gone cold, so she rebuilt the fire, using the last of Eve's wood supply and feeding it carefully until flames began to provide both light and heat. The temperature in the house was probably in the 40s, dangerously cold for someone in Eve's condition. Bianca found more blankets, more pillows, anything she could use to create a warm cocoon around the injured woman. She checked on the horses next, leading them into Eve's small barn where at least they'd be out of the wind. She stripped off their tack, rubbed them down as best she could with her numb hands, and gave them the hay she found stored in the barn. Both horses were exhausted, but they'd survived. Cinnamon kept looking toward the house, ears forward, clearly worried about her person. "She's alive," Bianca told the mare. "You saved her. Now rest." Back in the house, she settled in beside Eve, monitoring her constantly. She gave her more nitroglycerin when the pain intensified. She held her hand and talked to her through the worst moments, when Eve's breathing became so labored that Bianca thought she might be losing her. She made her take small sips of water to stay hydrated. She adjusted the blankets and added more wood to the fire. The hours passed in a blur of vigilance and fear. Eve drifted in and out of consciousness, and several times Bianca thought she was dying, her pulse becoming so weak and irregular that it seemed impossible she could survive. But each time the older woman would rally, would fight back, refusing to give up. Around midnight, Eve became more lucid, the pain seeming to ease slightly. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been. "You don't even know me. You barely spoke to me that day I bought hay. You could have died out there in that storm." Bianca thought about the question, about the decision she'd made that now seemed both obvious and insane. "Because Cinnamon asked me to," she said finally. "Because you were brave enough to ask for help in the only way you could. Because no one should die alone when there's something that can be done about it. Because if I'd stayed safe and let you die, I couldn't have lived with myself." "We only met once," Eve said. "We barely spoke. I bought hay. You loaded it. I paid you. That was it. Doesn't matter, you needed help. I could provide it. That's all that matters. That's what living out here means, isn't it? We look out for each other because no one else will. Because we understand what it's like to be this isolated, this vulnerable." Bianca paused, surprised to find herself getting emotional. "I've been so lonely since Lloyd died. Since my father died. Running that ranch by myself. Talking to myself. Going days without seeing another human. I think maybe I forgot that connection was even possible. That people could still matter to each other." "I know exactly what you mean," Eve said quietly. "After Robert died, I convinced myself I was fine alone. That needing people was weakness. That I could handle everything myself. And I almost died because of that stubbornness. If I'd moved to town like everyone suggested, I'd have had neighbors close by, I'd have had help. But I was too proud, too determined to prove I didn't need anyone." They talked through the long night, two women who'd both chosen isolation, discovering they had more in common than geography. Eve told stories about her life with Robert, about building the ranch together, about the dreams they'd had and the ones they'd achieved. Bianca talked about Lloyd, about the future they'd planned and how empty everything had felt after he died. They talked about ranching, about horses, about the challenges of running operations alone in an unforgiving landscape. "You know what's funny," Eve said as dawn began to lighten the windows. "I've lived next to your ranch for 15 years. 15 years, and we never really talked until tonight. We could have been friends all this time, could have helped each other, but we were both too independent, too convinced we had to do everything ourselves. We're talking now," Bianca pointed out. Better late than never. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down, and the snow stopped falling, leaving the world transformed and silent under a heavy white blanket. The sunrise painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, and through the window Bianca could see that they'd gotten at least 3 feet of accumulation, with drifts piled much higher in places. The Rocky Mountains in the distance looked like they'd been carved from ice. Bianca checked her phone and nearly wept when she saw a single bar of service. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher who answered. "Eve Warner, age 63, heart attack approximately 12 hours ago, stable but needs immediate medical attention. Current location, the old Mackenzie place, on Timber Ridge Road." The dispatcher told her it would be several hours. They had multiple emergencies across the county from the storm, but a helicopter would come as soon as conditions permitted. Those hours were the longest of Bianca's life. She kept Eve warm and stable, kept talking to her, kept her fighting. She fed the fire, and made weak tea from Eve's supplies, getting fluids into both of them. She checked on the horses, giving them more hay and water, praising them for their courage and strength. Cinnamon nickered when she saw her, and Bianca spent extra time with the mare, brushing her and telling her what a good, smart, brave horse she was. When the helicopter finally arrived around 10 o'clock, landing in a pasture Bianca had marked with bright orange panels she'd found in Eve's barn, she felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. The paramedics jumped out and took over, their professional efficiency both reassuring and overwhelming. They loaded Eve onto a stretcher, starting IV lines, hooking up monitors, working with practiced precision. One of the paramedics, a woman in her 40s, turned to Bianca. "You saved her life. The aspirin and nitroglycerin bought her critical time, and keeping her warm prevented shock from killing her. Another hour, maybe 2, and we'd probably be looking at a very different outcome. You did everything right." Eve grabbed Bianca's hand before they loaded her into the helicopter. Her grip was weak but determined. "Cinnamon, please, take care of her until I get back. Don't let them take her away." "I promise," Bianca said, squeezing back carefully. "She'll have the best care. She'll be treated like the hero she is. And you focus on getting better, so you can come home to her. Cinnamon is going to be waiting for you." After the helicopter lifted off, Bianca stood in the snow, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Every muscle in her body ached. Her face was windburned and raw. She was so tired she could barely think. But they'd made it. Eve was alive, and getting help, and both horses had survived. She still had to get herself and 2 exhausted horses back to her ranch. The ride home took nearly 3 hours, even though the distance was relatively short. Both horses were operating on nothing but determination, their exhaustion obvious in every step. But Maverick knew the way home, and he plodded forward steadily, Cinnamon following close beside him. The mare seemed to understand that her mission was complete, that her person was safe. She walked with her head down, but peacefully, no longer frantic. When they finally reached the Mountain View Ranch, Bianca felt such overwhelming gratitude that she started crying, tears freezing on her cheeks. She'd made it home. They'd all made it home. She spent the next several hours caring for Cinnamon and Maverick, rubbing them down carefully, checking every inch of them for injuries or frostbite, ensuring they had warm mash and plenty of water. She treated their legs with liniment and wrapped them carefully. She gave them extra grain and the best hay she had. These horses had saved a woman's life and carried Bianca safely through a killer storm. They deserved every bit of care she could provide. Cinnamon settled into the Mountain View Ranch as if she'd always belonged there. Bianca gave her the best stall, right next to Maverick, and the 2 horses quickly became companions. Cinnamon stayed close to the buckskin stallion, as if drawing comfort from his calm presence. Bianca spent hours every day grooming the mare and talking to her, and Cinnamon seemed to understand that she was safe, that her person was being cared for, that everything was going to be okay. Over the following days, as the county slowly dug out from the blizzard, Bianca kept in close contact with the hospital. Eve had suffered a serious myocardial infarction, a major heart attack that had damaged a significant portion of her heart muscle. But she was stable and responding well to treatment. She would need surgery, a triple bypass operation to restore blood flow around the blocked arteries, but her doctors were optimistic. The aspirin and nitroglycerin had prevented additional clotting, and the relatively quick medical intervention once she reached the hospital had limited the damage. With surgery and rehabilitation, Eve would make a full recovery. 2 weeks after the storm, Bianca drove to the hospital in town to visit Eve. The older woman was sitting up in bed, color returned to her face, looking tired but alive and alert. Medical equipment surrounded her, monitors beeping steadily, IV lines running into her arms, but her eyes were bright when Bianca entered, and she smiled broadly. "Bianca," she said, her voice much stronger than it had been that terrible night. "They tell me I'm going to make a full recovery. The surgery went perfectly. My doctors say I'll be better than I was before, as long as I follow their instructions and don't go back to doing everything myself, because of you getting to me in time." "Because of Cinnamon," Bianca corrected. "She's the real hero. I just followed her lead." "How is she? Is she okay? I've been so worried about her." "She's wonderful. She's made friends with my horses, especially Maverick. They're inseparable now. She's eating well, gaining back the weight she lost during her journey. And she's waiting patiently for you to come home. Every morning, she stands at the fence looking north, like she knows you're out there somewhere." Eve's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you. You risked your life for a stranger. You could have died in that storm." "You're not a stranger anymore," Bianca said simply. They talked for over an hour, really talked for the first time in their lives. Eve shared stories about her life before ranching, about meeting Robert and building their operation together, about the slow process of learning to live alone after he died. Bianca told her own stories, about growing up on the Mountain View Ranch, about losing her father and Lloyd, about the bone-deep loneliness that came with running a place by herself. "We're not that different, are we?" Eve observed. "Both trying to keep our family's legacies alive. Both stubborn enough to do it alone rather than admit we need help. Both too proud to reach out to our neighbors. Maybe we don't have to do it completely alone anymore," Bianca said carefully. "My ranch borders yours to the south. Our properties touch for almost 3 miles. If you're interested, maybe we could help each other. Check in regularly, cover for each other during emergencies. Share equipment and resources. Work together instead of separately." Eve studied her for a long moment. "I've spent 3 years refusing help, convinced I had to prove I could do everything myself. That asking for help meant I was weak, that I was disrespecting Robert's memory by admitting I couldn't handle the ranch alone. And it almost killed me. I think maybe it's time I learned that accepting help isn't weakness. That independence doesn't mean isolation." Eve's doctor came in then to check on her, so Bianca said her goodbyes and promised to visit again soon. As she drove back to the ranch, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Not just hope that she could keep the ranch running, but hope that she might actually build something better than what she'd had. That loneliness wasn't an inevitable cost of the life she'd chosen. Eve came home 6 weeks after the storm, still recovering, but getting stronger every day. Bianca picked her up from the hospital and drove her back to the Mackenzie place, where she'd spent several days cleaning up and preparing for her return. Cinnamon was waiting in the pasture, and when Eve's truck pulled up, the mare started calling out, running along the fence line. The reunion between horse and human left Bianca in tears. Cinnamon ran to the fence, her eyes bright, her ears forward, calling desperately to the woman who'd sent her through a storm. Eve, moving carefully because of her recent surgery, walked across the yard as quickly as she could. The mare lowered her head into Eve's arms, and the two of them stood like that for a long time, woman and horse, both survivors of an impossible night. Eve was crying, stroking Cinnamon's face, whispering things too soft for Bianca to hear. The mare made soft nickering sounds, pressing against Eve, as if reassuring herself that her person was really there, really alive, really home. "You saved me," Eve said to the mare, her voice thick with emotion. "You were so brave. You ran through that storm and found help when I thought I was going to die. You're such a good girl, such a smart, wonderful girl." Over the following months, Bianca and Eve developed a partnership that transformed both their ranches. They started small, checking in with each other every morning via phone, just to confirm both were okay. Then they began sharing equipment, coordinating purchases to split costs. Eve's tractor worked better than Bianca's, so they used it for both properties. Bianca's hay equipment was newer, so they used it for both operations. They started trading work, Bianca helping with Eve's cattle while Eve helped with Bianca's horses. But more importantly, they became genuine friends. They discovered they both loved old Western movies and started having regular movie nights, alternating between the two ranches. They found they shared similar views on ranching philosophy, on animal welfare, on the importance of sustainable practices. They began planning together, coordinating their breeding programs, thinking about the future of both ranches, not as separate entities but as complementary operations. The isolation that had characterized both their lives began to ease. They had someone to call when equipment broke down or weather threatened. They had someone who understood the challenges they faced, who spoke the language of ranching, who didn't need things explained. They had someone to celebrate successes with and commiserate with over setbacks. The difference was profound and immediate. On a spring morning 10 months after the storm, Bianca and Eve stood together at the fence line that separated their properties, watching their horses graze peacefully in adjoining pastures. Cinnamon and Maverick had become inseparable, the chestnut mare and the buckskin stallion often standing together, their companionship clear and deep. "You know what I've been thinking," Eve said. "We should breed Cinnamon and Maverick. The foal would be something special. The offspring of two horses who saved their humans, who showed more courage and intelligence than most people ever manage." Bianca smiled. "I think that's a perfect idea. The bloodlines would be excellent, and the foal would carry a story worth telling." They stood in comfortable silence. Two women who'd both known what it meant to face death and loneliness, who'd both learned that survival sometimes depends on the courage to ask for help, and the willingness to answer that call. The ranches that had once isolated them now connected them. The horses that had brought them together continued to bind them. "Thank you," Eve said quietly, "for everything. For coming through that storm. For taking care of Cinnamon. For giving me a reason to stop being so stubborn about accepting help. For reminding me that community matters more than pride." "Thank you for being brave enough to send Cinnamon," Bianca replied. "For showing me that I don't have to do everything alone either. For reminding me what matters. For becoming my friend." The following spring, Cinnamon gave birth to a beautiful colt, a perfect combination of his parents, with his mother's chestnut coloring and his father's powerful build. They named him Storm, in honor of the blizzard that had brought their humans together. The foal was healthy and strong, and from his earliest days, he showed the intelligence and courage that characterized both his parents. Bianca and Eve raised Storm together, both contributing to his training, both invested in his future. The colt became a symbol of what they'd built, proof that from the worst circumstances could come something beautiful and strong. But more valuable than anything else was that they'd found each other. 2 years after the storm, they formally merged their operations, creating the Warner Spears Ranch, a partnership that made both properties more viable and sustainable. They hired 2 hands to help with the work, allowing both women to focus on the breeding program and ranch management, rather than exhausting themselves with constant physical labor. On the 2nd anniversary of the storm, they held a small celebration at Bianca's ranch house. Friends from throughout the county came, people who'd followed their story and been inspired by it. As the sun set, painting the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple, they walked out to the pasture where Cinnamon, Maverick, and Storm grazed peacefully. The horses looked up when they approached, Cinnamon nickering softly in greeting. Bianca and Eve stood at the fence, watching their horses in the fading light. "Do you ever think about that night?" Eve asked. "About how different things could have been?" "Every day," Bianca admitted. "If Cinnamon hadn't made it through the storm. If I'd decided to wait until morning. If any number of small things had gone differently, we wouldn't be standing here. You might not be alive. I might still be completely alone, still convinced that isolation was just the price of ranching. But none of those things happened," Eve said. "Cinnamon was brave enough. You were brave enough. And here we are." "Here we are," Bianca agreed. They stood in comfortable silence. 2 women who'd both known loneliness and loss. Who'd both learned that survival sometimes depends on the courage to ask for help and the courage to answer that call. The ranch that had once been Bianca's burden alone was now their shared dream, built on the foundation of an impossible rescue and sustained by mutual respect, trust, and genuine friendship. Cinnamon lifted her head and called across the pasture. Maverick answered. And Storm, the colt born from their union, ran between them with the joyful abandon of youth, embodying the future they were building together. A legacy not just of land and horses, but of resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between those who refused to let isolation win. The note attached to Cinnamon's tail had been a cry for help that changed 2 lives forever. But it had also been a bridge between 2 solitary souls, proof that even in the most isolated places, connection is possible. All it takes is the courage to reach out, and someone brave enough to reach back. If this story of courage, survival, and unexpected friendship touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of horses and the humans whose lives they transform. Have you ever witnessed an animal saving a life? Share your story in the comments below. We love hearing from our amazing community. And if you know someone who's facing challenges alone, someone who needs to hear this message about the importance of connection and asking for help, please share this video with them. Remember, help sometimes arrives on 4 hooves, and the bravest thing we can do is admit we need each other. Until next time, keep believing in the power of compassion, the intelligence of animals, and the bonds that save us when we need it most.